My parents told me that at 13, I was officially the man of the house. To them, that meant mowing lawns, scrubbing toilets, handing over every dime I made. Meanwhile, my 25-year-old sister Grace was chauffeured around like she was auditioning for the crown. But when they decided my hard-earned savings should fund her cosmetic surgery, I stopped playing along. One phone call was all it took to turn the tables, and it set off a chain reaction involving a $300,000 inheritance they never saw coming. And it all started with their idea of raising a proper man, the family circus setup. When most kids were stumbling through middle school, my parents had me locked into their program for what they proudly called becoming a proper man. At 13, my weekends didn't look like video games or sports. They looked like a work schedule. Saturday morning started before sunrise with me tightening mower blades like I was prepping for war against the backyard. Winters weren't any easier. When snow piled up, I was the one in frozen boots clearing driveways while my dad stood in the doorway declaring cold shapes men. That was their motto in action. Chores weren't chores, they were training. And they had a name for every miserable task. Scrub the floors, building character. Do the dishes until my hands stank of soap. Discipline. Push the mower in 90-degree heat. Strength. Each line was delivered like some slogan from a motivational poster no one asked for. I went along with it because arguing only made the list longer. But here's the kicker. This so-called training plan only applied to me. Grace, somehow, was exempt from every single lesson. If I was the unpaid intern in this little operation, Grace was the crown princess. She wouldn't lift a finger while I sweated outside, and that wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. Parents chauffeured her around when she needed to go somewhere, while I walked or biked, usually after finishing whatever job was on my list. For manicure chips, my mom was on the phone booking her a fix. Meanwhile, when my fingernails cracked from hauling bags of lawn waste, my dad praised it as proof that I was earning toughness. The double standard didn't just exist, it was the family rule book, and they had excuses for everything. Grace needed rides everywhere? That was safety. Grace couldn't carry her laundry basket? That was focus on her education. Grace skipped chores altogether? That was preparing her for respect. Somehow, every excuse bent into a halo around her. Meanwhile, me lugging garbage bags in the rain was molding me into a man. She got rewarded with chocolate bars and candles for stress relief. I got a lecture if I left my work boots near the doorway instead of lined up perfectly. Calling it a balanced system would have been comedy. My daily routine was a full-time conditioning program. Mow the lawn, haul the trash, rotate mattresses, it never ended. Grace's tasks looked more like spa treatments. At times, the dog had more responsibilities than she did. By the time I wiped sweat off my forehead, she was sipping the latte my parents bought her, scrolling her phone like life was one long self-care day. What stuck with me wasn't only the work, it was how convinced my parents were that their system made sense. They sold it like it was the secret recipe for raising a son. They thought they were building me into a man while protecting her as a delicate prize. Every so often I'd ask why Grace didn't have to do anything. That never went well. The stock answer, her role is different. Different meaning one of us lived like staff, while the other role played royalty. That kind of imbalance does its own math. You don't decide to keep score, but the scoreboard builds itself. When I wanted a bike at 13, I was told to earn it through extra labor. When Grace wanted a handbag, one magically appeared wrapped in tissue at the foot of her bed. I had to sweat for every small thing I wished for. She got things handed to her overnight. It didn't take genius to figure out how fast resentment was stacking. And yet, from a distance, it almost felt like a sketch comedy. Imagine me sprinting to scrub oven stains while Grace debated which nail polish suited her better. If chores were Olympic events, I'd be competing in endurance vacuuming while she celebrated gold and lounging with Wi-Fi. The family looked like a circus, one kid grinding like a farmhand, the other reclining like a guest at a resort. But here's the truth that mattered. Beneath the laughs and absurd stories, that circus carved something permanent into me. It wasn't just annoyance at chores, it was watching loyalty break down. Seeing Grace treated like royalty while I got treated like labor forced me to lower my expectations of what fairness from my parents even looked like. By the time I was still a teenager, I knew I couldn't rely on them to value me the same way they valued her. That realization burned in deeper than any single afternoon of mowing or scrubbing could. And Grace? She didn't hesitate to lean into it. She grew up soaking in the message that everyone existed to orbit her, which set the stage for what came next, her belief that every room she stepped into should center on her, no questions asked. Grace was the kind of person who acted like royalty without ever getting an invitation to the throne. Walk into a room, and she had to dominate it. If there was silence, she filled it with commentary about herself, her hair, her day, or the long list of people who supposedly envied her. Every grocery run turned into her personal red carpet ceremony, while the rest of us faded into the role of unpaid extras. At home, she strutted past the couch like paparazzi were waiting just out of frame. It wasn't just spoiled behavior, it was entitlement polished to the level of a routine. And here's a statistic that defined her more than anything else. No friend or boyfriend lasted more than 6 months. 6 months was the absolute threshold. The pattern played out the same way every time. New friendships started with laughter and daily plans. By the second month, Grace was already exhausting them with endless demands. By month 4, the fatigue showed: missed calls, strained hangouts, awkward silences. By month 6, gone. Relationships followed the exact same timeline. At first, devoted conversation. Then a slow drift into running errands for her, endless reassurance, and increasingly tense dinners. By the halfway point of a year, the whole thing collapsed. Watching this cycle repeat taught me 2 things. She drained people dry, and she never once recognized her role in creating the problem. If she defended these losses, the script always blamed someone else. Friends didn't collapse under her weight. They were jealous. Boyfriends didn't break up. They just couldn't handle her greatness. She never once paused to ask, am I part of this? That question simply didn't live in her head. To Grace, she was extraordinary. Misunderstood brilliance cut from finer material than anyone around her. Self-reflection wasn't dismissed, it never existed. The reason she lived in that permanent bubble could be traced directly back to my parents. She never learned consequences because my parents rewrote reality for her. If she skipped homework, the teacher was incompetent. If she got a bad grade, Mom was practically in court, ready to argue it away. If she stormed out of a friendship, Dad reassured her the other kids weren't on her level. They turned every bump into outside sabotage until Grace fully believed the world owed her constant accommodation. The mashed potato incident was my go-to example. One holiday dinner, she melted down because the serving bowl didn't reach her first. Never mind that she had already been served 3 dishes before anyone else. She sulked, scolded everyone on manners, and hijacked the evening over potato order. I remember sitting there thinking, if she can turn vegetables into a full-scale insult, she would make any emergency about how inconvenient it was for her. Later that night, she sincerely believed the family had learned a hard lesson to never delay her serving again. Mom and Dad nodded along like she just presented her case in Parliament. It was absurd, but that's how every tantrum ended, with her convinced she was right, and all of us quietly stunned anyone could take it that seriously. If outsiders noticed this behavior, they didn't stick around long enough to dig deeper. Grace went through friends faster than most people cycle through TV shows. The 6-month stretch became a standing joke for me and Kelsey. We never said it out loud, but privately we guessed what would cause the next collapse. Would it be the time she refused to split a restaurant bill? Or the day she filled every group chat with a 20-photo streak of selfies? We watched the countdown tick away. It wasn't sadness by then, it was routine. Like we were watching a rerun we already knew the ending to. Her confidence, of course, stayed bulletproof. Each time a friend disappeared or a boyfriend ghosted, she interpreted it as proof she deserved stronger devotion, not as a sign that maybe she should lower her demands. The disconnect between how she saw herself and how everyone else experienced her was staggering. Inside the house, she lived on a pedestal. Outside of it, people walked away with exhaustion stamped on their faces, and the cycle just never changed. If anyone had the stamina to last half a year in her orbit, they deserved recognition. Because 6 months around Grace wasn't just a friendship, it was endurance training. To get through it, you had to practice ignoring drama, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, and nodding along until your neck hurt. Nearly everybody ended the experience cut off, drained, and absolutely sure they would never volunteer again. But she never read the room. To her, every exit was a betrayal rather than a reflection of her behavior. This was who Grace became, shaped from years of never being told no. All spotlight, no accountability. To live with her was to accept the force fields of delusion that never let criticism in. That environment wore heavy on me, but even more, it created a sharp contrast to the one person who kept me sane in that house. Kelsey, the hidden gem. Kelsey was the calm in a house that never stopped spinning. Where Grace marched around like she had declared herself royalty, Kelsey moved quietly, with a kind of dry wit that slipped through when you least expected it. She wasn't out for an audience. She wasn't competing for attention. She was the one who actually remembered to say thank you when someone passed her a plate at dinner. Growing up beside her made me feel like there was at least one reminder of normal in a place that often didn't feel like home. She never demanded anything. She didn't expect applause or special treatment. If you asked her to do something, she'd roll her eyes a little, maybe make a joke under her breath, but then she'd actually step up and do it. That simple, grounded behavior stood out in a household built on theatrics. And that's why I started feeling protective of her. I could see how young she was, how easily she could have gotten dragged into the same script my parents were constantly writing around Grace. I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen. I wasn't going to watch her become another version of Grace. Our parents, of course, tried to push her in that direction. Their favorite line was, "Watch how Grace carries herself." They wanted Kelsey to imitate the very behaviors that drained every friendship Grace ever had. And even though they thought they were being subtle, I heard it every time. I remember one evening, Kelsey was about 12, sitting at the table in a hoodie and jeans, and my mom leaned over and told her she should add some flair like Grace. Kelsey just looked baffled, like someone had asked her to learn calculus in real time. Later that night, I told her flat out she didn't need to copy anyone. It was one of those little conversations that probably didn't seem big at the moment, but moments like that became everything between us. That's how our bond started. Quiet interventions, little reminders that she got to write her own script. After my mom's lecture about flair, I walked with Kelsey to school the next morning and made a joke about how maybe I'd start carrying myself like Grace too, stroking my hair in the wind, demanding to be driven to class in a parade. She actually laughed, and that laughter mattered more than I could explain. It was our language for resisting, a way to remind her that if the whole thing felt absurd, that's because it was. Over time, those small moments stacked into a kind of alliance. We had our own shields. When our parents praised Grace's latest outfit like it was red carpet worthy, we whispered back and forth lines about Grace needing a stylist just to make it through gym class. The more our parents pushed comparisons, the sharper our private jokes became. We weren't mocking Grace as much as we were rejecting the idea that Kelsey had to aspire to that model. It was survival, and it kept us both sane. The irony was that Kelsey had a better sense of herself than anyone gave her credit for. She wasn't loud about it, but she wasn't unsure either. She didn't care about playing queen or center stage. She just wanted to go to school, watch her shows, and enjoy her space without being turned into a walking performance for other people. My parents couldn't see that. They thought her not wanting the spotlight was a flaw that needed correcting. They had no idea that her refusal to perform was actually strength. There were nights when she'd come sit in my room, frustrated by how different she felt from what was expected. She wasn't used to venting, but every once in a while it would spill out. Her confusion about why she had to be evaluated against someone who lived in constant drama. I didn't always have answers, but I listened. I kept telling her there was nothing wrong with being different, that ignoring their script didn't make her wrong. It made her smarter. Maybe I didn't fix her problems, but I gave her something our parents never did: permission to resist. Looking back, I think what made me most offensive of her was knowing she still had time to escape it all. My so-called responsibilities were cemented by then. My path was already written by parents who believed in raising a man through endless chores and work. But Kelsey was still just young enough that maybe she could duck out, and I wanted to make sure she did. Anytime I saw her second-guess herself because of some comparison I tried to cut in, it was part instinct, part promise. I wouldn't let her get swallowed by the pedestal building that consumed Grace. Even with all that pressure around her, Kelsey started finding subtle ways to push back. I noticed at one dinner when my dad was going on about how Grace carries herself with confidence. Kelsey just gave this eye roll so sharp it could have cut glass. She didn't say anything, but the look was enough. And later that night, when she tossed off a sarcastic impression of the compliment, I realized she was developing her own defense. That quiet rebellion gave me real relief. It meant she wasn't buying the propaganda, not entirely. I kept rooting for her in ways that probably went unnoticed by anyone else. If our parents nitpicked her clothes, I'd tell her her hoodie looked better than Grace's makeup-heavy parade. If they acted like she should try harder to match her sister, I'd remind her she was already better off not needing to. Those little nudges mattered because I needed her to know, beyond any doubt, that not everyone in the house believed the comparison game. And maybe more importantly, I needed her to know I believed in her. So, while Grace lived in a spotlight of her parents' making, Kelsey lived with the constant pressure of being drafted into a copy she never asked to be. She didn't scream against it, but she didn't absorb it either. That's what made her the hidden gem in the house. She was proof that you could exist in that mess and still stay yourself, quietly in the corner. And me? I stepped into the role of shield, making sure their failed attempts to sculpt her into Grace 2.0 didn't stick. In the end, what our parents were really trying to do was relaunch a performance nobody wanted tickets to. They had Grace as the star of their show, and they wanted a sequel. Kelsey wasn't interested, I wasn't letting them, and that silent failure gave me more hope than anything else. But the pressure around her never fully let up, and neither did mine. If Kelsey carried the weight of dodging her parents' expectations, I carried another version, being told since 13 that becoming a man meant constant work, constant sacrifice, and no room for mistakes. And that's where my story kept turning back on itself. While she fought against being dragged into performance, I was learning what it meant to lose entire pieces of childhood to responsibilities I never asked for. The disappearing childhood. Looking back, what slipped away faster than anything else was the version of childhood I never got to have. While most kids were knee-deep in middle school rituals, testing out sports, getting awkward crushes, or battling over whose turn it was on the Xbox, my days looked more like a resume. Babysitting kids who weren't even that much younger than me. Washing dishes in a cafe that soaked me in grease until I smelled like burnt toast hours after. Scraping gum from cafe chairs or roaming neighborhoods with a lawnmower. It wasn't childhood. It was a full-time job I never applied for. The oddest part wasn't the work itself. Plenty of teenagers land a part-time job to grab pocket money. It was the way my parents framed it, as if every shift, every coin saved, was proof I was climbing their sacred ladder of manhood. To them, it wasn't just mowing lawns or chasing dogs. It was training, evidence. Every petty dollar counted, they told me, because wages equaled wisdom and exhaustion equaled strength. Miss a chance to work, and it was weakness. Accept a gig, even if it cut into school or sleep and you were proving yourself. That expectation left no room for me to say no. If a neighbor needed help, my parents volunteered me before I could speak. Someone down the street mentioned they'd pay for snow shoveling, and before I had my boots laced, my dad shoved gloves in my hands. None of it was optional. When I said I was tired, I was told men don't complain. If I asked for a break, I got real men balance it all. Those words were repeated until they became background noise in my head. Instead of being a teenager, I was an unpaid intern for a role I'd never signed up to play. Sometimes, though, I found moments of dark humor in it. I remember stacking coins I'd saved from weeks of babysitting and finally buying a skateboard. I thought that board was freedom on wheels, proof I had earned something for myself. But when I rolled down the street, it hit me. I was practicing balance on grip tape at the exact same age my peers were practicing balance in actual friendships or memories. Another time, after mowing 3 lawns in a row, I walked away clutching $20 like it was financial stability. At 13, $20 felt like I'd finally made it. Now, looking back, it's absurd. I thought pocket change was building a future when really it was just buying into the illusion that effort guaranteed approval. And it never stopped. At 14, I was stacking dirty dishes in restaurant kitchens. At 15, hauling garbage bags taller than me across icy sidewalks. At 16, tutoring younger kids long into the night, then dragging myself half asleep through school the next morning. Every year was another patch of hours spent working instead of living. My friends asked me to hang out, shoot hoops, or watch a movie, and I'd respond with a list of jobs I had to rush off to. To me, missing out felt mandatory. To my parents, all that exhaustion was a badge of honor. They praised every shift as if I was collecting medals. But it wasn't medals, it was interruptions I never escaped. Basketball was replaced by laundry runs. After-school pizza hangouts replaced by greasy cafe shifts. Even when I wanted time to breathe, my parents turned it into another lecture on discipline. They claimed every sacrifice was investment in my future, but the truth was simpler and harsher. The sacrifices weren't even about me. They were building a supply for someone else. That realization landed hard later, when I noticed what they actually saw when they looked at my savings. My hours weren't independence. My bank account wasn't stability. It was inventory. Stock reserved for the family. And more often than not, that meant grace. The kid who never broke a sweat, never scraped gum off chair legs, never smelled like fryer grease a day in her life. She was waiting at the finish line for the results of my labor. If my work had an equation, it was my lost hours plus my lost childhood, divided neatly into her next purchase. When I was younger, I thought every shift was proof I was earning more than money. I thought I was earning recognition. I imagined that one day, all the skipped nights out and extra jobs would finally balance the scale, that my parents would look at me and actually see me as enough. But the more I worked, the clearer it became. That scale was never going to tip. It's almost funny if you think about it. Me scrubbing a cafe pan until my hands cracked, while Grace was at home scrolling filters, wondering if Valencia or Amaro better captured her mood. My work funded her bubble. My sweat created her comfort. And when I tried to convince myself it was all building toward approval, it didn't matter how late I stayed up or how much money I saved, the outcome stayed the same. Because the punchline at the end of all that effort wasn't triumph. It wasn't respect or gratitude or independence. It was the cold realization that no amount of work could purchase the one thing I wanted: approval. That was never for sale, no matter how many hours I handed over. And it was in that silence, when years of effort piled into nothing, that I started waiting desperately for a win of my own. Something that couldn't be redirected or dismissed. Something that might finally, even briefly, feel like it belonged to me. The scholarship shock. When the email came through telling me I'd been awarded a full-ride scholarship, it didn't feel real at first. After years of mopping floors, walking packs of restless dogs, shoveling ice at sunrise, and patching together whatever jobs I could grab, here was something that wasn't dependent on parental approval or endless labor. A full education, covered. I remember staring at the screen like it might vanish if I blinked too hard. For once, I had concrete proof that effort hadn't just disappeared into someone else's comfort. I printed the letter and held it in my hands, trying to imagine what it would feel like to finally have something my parents couldn't wave off. That night, I stepped into the kitchen, clutching the letter like a trophy, and for a second I really believed this would be the moment. Maybe they'd clap, maybe even say, however awkwardly, that they were proud. Their son, the one they'd pushed to work nonstop since childhood, was about to go to college without costing them a cent. No tuition bills, no fees, no excuse left for them to turn it sideways. I braced for recognition. It lasted all of 5 seconds. I had barely finished reading aloud before my dad cut in with a shrug and a flat, "Don't get comfortable." My mom followed without looking away from Grace's mirror, tossing out, "Don't be lazy." That was it. My entire future was reduced to 2 warnings, like the scholarship was more of a risk than a reward. Grace was perched on the counter through all of this, practicing her eyeliner in the toaster's reflection. Halfway through my explanation about how the scholarship even included book stipends, she cut me off to ask if her left eye matched her right. The conversation shifted instantly, my parents leaning forward to reassure her while my letter dangled useless in my hand. My entire life had just changed, but for them the headline was her makeup symmetry. I can still picture the moment, me standing there, paper trembling in my fingers, while the 3 of them leaned into a debate about eyeliner angles. If it weren't on my life, you could have filmed it as a sitcom bit. The hard-working kid gets a scholarship, but the laugh track roars for eyeliner drama. Except in my version, there was no audience to see how wrong it was. Just me realizing in real time where I ranked in their order of importance. When the conversation finally limped back to me, my dad circled around the letter and landed squarely on logistics. Where would I live? How would I pay for food, transportation, laundry, anything outside tuition? His expression made it clear the scholarship wasn't an end. It was the starting point for a new job he expected me to cover. My mom nodded along, suggesting that since the big stuff was paid for, I had room to be more generous with my savings. Generous meaning, as always, Grace. That shift told me everything. To them, the scholarship wasn't mine. It was simply another resource in the family economy, another justification for redirecting what I'd saved. Recognition of my effort was dangerous. It threatened their script where I was always the support act. So they drained the victory dry, twisting it into a fresh reminder of what more I owed. The speed of it hit harder than the words themselves. I hadn't had even a single minute to stand in the warmth of the wind before they snuffed it out. 1 second, I pictured a peak, years of labor stacking into acknowledgement. The next second, I was back in quicksand, the ground shifting under me as they moved the goalposts again. It would have been easier to stomach if they had at least faked pride, even briefly. But their disinterest was sharp. My mom's eyes never left Grace's face. My dad spoke like a manager reminding an employee not to waste company resources. And Grace? She half listened only long enough to hijack the attention back toward herself. For her, my scholarship existed only as background noise for her mirror check. In the silence after, I realized for the first time this wasn't a cycle that could be broken by proving myself. There was no achievement high enough to reset the imbalance. Grace's chipped fingernail outranked my full education. Her slightest inconvenience overshadowed years of effort, and my parents wanted to keep it that way. If acknowledgement cracked through even once, it would expose every excuse they'd used to sideline me. So they downplayed it into something smaller than an errand. Don't get comfortable. Don't be lazy. And just like that, what should have been my clean break became the setup for another demand. Because once they dismissed the scholarship, the next target was obvious. Rent, food, transportation, living costs. All things they argued should come straight from the money I had hoarded since 13. My supposed ticket to independence instantly morphed into leverage for them to tighten their grip. That realization sat on my chest like a heavy stone. Something I thought was proof of escape had, in their eyes, become proof that I could give more. It was never about celebrating me. It was about rerouting my effort back into their system. The script didn't change. They just found new lines to keep me in character. And with that script came the next act waiting around the corner. If tuition covered itself, then my savings were now available. Not for me, never for me. In their logic, my work had always been a family resource to be redirected at will. And that night in the kitchen, though I didn't know the details yet, I could feel what was coming. Their attention wasn't going to stop at rent and groceries. They were preparing to cash in my effort for something else entirely, something that made all those stolen hours of work feel even cheaper. That shift in their tone, that immediate glance at what more could be pulled from me, marked the moment the real conflict started to take shape. Because when they finally laid out their next demand, it didn't sound like a financial conversation at all. It sounded like a punchline, the kind delivered in a Sunday afternoon tone. dropped between casual airings and framed as if it were some family emergency. And for me, it would be the moment where disbelief burned into anger. The moment when their priorities became so absurd it was impossible not to laugh first, then explode. The cosmetic surgery bombshell. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of low-energy day where nothing important is supposed to happen. I had just sunk into the couch after a weekend shift when my mom sat down beside me, careful and casual, like she was about to remind me we were out of milk. Instead, she delivered a line that made my stomach twist. Grace, she announced, had decided on improving herself. At first, I didn't get it. I thought she meant Grace was enrolling in a class, or maybe trying something healthy like joining a gym. Something that, for once, might actually make her more tolerable to live with. But then she clarified. This wasn't about growth or learning. It was about plastic surgery. And when she said the family should pitch in, what she actually meant was that my savings were already being claimed. I laughed when she first said it, out loud, without meaning to. Not because I found it funny, but because I couldn't believe this was real. All those years of dog, walking in the cold, mowing until my back ached, stumbling home from late-night cafe shifts, and now the suggestion was that every hour of it had just been a down payment for Grace's nose. My own future, my safety net, traded away for more flattering selfies. Come again? I asked, half hoping I'd misheard. She repeated it word for word, calm and certain, like this wasn't outrageous. Then came her reasoning. This was about supporting Grace's confidence. The whole family was supposed to back her. The catch being that the family somehow meant only me. Then my dad entered. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. He just stood there, nodding like my mom had given the sermon of the year. And he doubled down. To him, this wasn't cosmetic at all. It was a moment that defined Grace's future, a kind of emergency you couldn't afford to ignore. They framed it like life and death. If I didn't contribute, Grace's entire path forward was in jeopardy. The language they used sounded absurd, but the tone was deadly serious. It wasn't guilt anymore. It felt like theft wrapped in family slogans. I snapped. How does my hard work suddenly belong to Grace's vanity project? I demanded. Their answer had no creativity, just the same phrase they've been using since I was 13. Because you're the man of the house. It didn't matter that Grace was 25, old enough to manage her own choices, or that she'd been spoiled so relentlessly she had no concept of sacrifice. To them, her wants were fragile glass, something priceless that had to be protected. And apparently, the cost of that protection was draining the only person in the family who had ever actually worked. The way they dropped the request like it was normal enraged me even more. They spoke as if I should already be reaching for my wallet while Grace primped upstairs. Everything I had saved was seen as communal property, not mine. That was the message. My past and my future were resources they could claim whenever her comfort demanded it. I couldn't hold in the sarcasm. I told them flat out it was robbery with better lighting. I mocked the gravity they placed on it, saying maybe next time Grace wanted a new purse, we'd declare a national disaster. If she chipped a nail, maybe we should sell the car and host a telethon. My favorite jab was renaming the whole ordeal Operation Save Grace's Selfies. That one hit them like I had insulted a revered figure. My mom's face crumpled with shock, as if questioning Grace's entitlement was blasphemy. My dad puffed out his chest and repeated his line again. A man looks after his family. I shot back at this. It wasn't family. It was servitude. That real family meant looking out for each other, not funneling everything into one person's reflection. I told them if they wanted surgery money so badly, they could auction off a fraction of the things they'd already spoiled her with. Grace's wardrobe alone could cover half the cost, but of course, that was untouchable. The look of confusion on their faces stuck with me. They had expected me to cave. For years, I had been molded to accept every new weight they handed me without fighting back, and suddenly, I wasn't following the script. They tried to repeat themselves as if layering family sacrifice over and over would make it sound legitimate. But the words had lost their power. I wasn't hearing duty anymore. I was hearing them say Grace's wants outranked my survival. The anger boiled fast. Every lawn I cut, every babysitting night, every diner floor I scrubbed replayed in my head, spliced with this absurd demand. All those years they told me it was building my future, and now they wanted to strip it away before I even started living it. My scholarship had already been written off as background noise. Zow, now my savings were being treated as disposable cash for surgery that didn't even involve me. At that point, I understood it wasn't favoritism, it was blindness. They would never recognize me as anything beyond a source. So I said it clearly, not a dime. This time, I didn't mumble or negotiate. I laid it down in plain words. I told them their priorities were so backwards, they'd make a satire look profound. If Grace wanted a new nose, then maybe it was time she put in work for the first time in her life. Their outrage at me saying this only proved how unshakable their bias had become. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the sound of my own pulse in my ears. They looked at me like I had broken a sacred law of the house. But for once, I wasn't drowning in guilt. I felt the absurdity spilling out of me as laughter edged into anger. I wasn't going to be their resource, not anymore. Operation Save Grace's Selfies wasn't going to happen on my watch. And that break in the pattern, even though it stunned them into disbelief, did something new for me. It marked the edge of tolerance, the instant where the cycle I'd been shoved into hit its wall. From that point forward, I couldn't just keep running the same track. Something had to change, and I knew I was going to force that change myself. Because once you realize you're only valued as a source, you stop pretending the system is worth following. And by the end of that Sunday, I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to face this alone. Something deeper in me decided that if they wanted to push me against the wall, then it was time to reach for the one person in the family they couldn't ignore. Breaking point and call for backup. I hit a wall that day, the kind where you realize no amount of endurance will change the direction you're being pushed. Saying no to funding Grace's surgery wasn't just about money. It was about stopping a script I'd been forced to follow since I was 13. And the silence that followed my refusal was short-lived. Almost immediately, the counterattacks began, layers of guilt that landed with pinpoint precision. Mom leaned across from me, eyes sharp and rehearsed, telling me I was letting my sister suffer. That was her word, suffer. As though going without a cosmetic procedure belonged in the same category as hunger or homelessness. She phrased it like I had failed a moral experiment, turning absence of gratitude into evidence of my cruelty. Dad joined in with his usual gravity, repeating, "A real man looks out for his family." Over and over, every syllable carried like a sermon, with the clear implication that I was dishonorable for refusing. Both of them cornered me in that kitchen, running their lines like they'd been rehearsed their entire lives. The guilt crept deeper. They pointed backward, naming off meals, clothes, and roof repairs they had given me, tallying up the role of basic parenting as though I owed a lifetime of interest payments. Then, as if that wasn't enough, they circled into distortion, claiming that Grace never asked for much, that this was a singular request, just this one thing. They repeated that phrase until it lost its meaning, like a chant designed to wear me out. But the truth smoldered in my head. Every sacrifice I had made was framed as just one thing. Every year of dog walking in the rain, every late-night cafe shift, every hour spent patching their chores into my day. They had all been dressed up as one more step proving my worth. There was a collection of just one thing that spanned my entire adolescence. By then, my chest was tight, jaw aching from grinding down the words I wanted to spit out. I wanted to tell them that Grace had never sacrificed anything real. That she breathed in the air of privilege so thoughtlessly that she couldn't even identify. But as they layered on more chants of duty and family, I realized the truth. Nothing I said would matter. Logic wouldn't cut through the fog. Their plan wasn't to reason with me, it was to wear me until I caved. And that's when I understood I needed reinforcement. There was only one person I could call who could slice through their act. Grandpa. I didn't even hesitate. I reached for my phone, and in that moment, it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. His was the only voice I knew they couldn't steamroll. The one authority my father actually listened to without twisting the meaning. They froze the second I thumbed in the number. My dad's face dropped from confident to defensive in the space of 3 heartbeats. My mom muttered that I was making it bigger than it was, whispering family issues stay in the family. But the call was already ringing, and my decision was irreversible. There are moments you prepare for quietly, without knowing, and this was one of them. Grandpa answered faster than usual, his voice gravelly but alert. All I had to say was I need help, and he didn't wait for dramatic pauses. I laid it out clean. The years of so-called training disguised as chores, the endless list of after-school jobs, the constant message that my money was never really my own. And finally, the demand that my savings be used as a donation to Grace's Vanity. I didn't paint over it or soften the edges. I told him outright it was about selfies, not survival. Every word came with years of weight pressing out of my lungs. The silence that answered wasn't doubt, it was brewing. I knew that silence. It wasn't indecision. It was the moment before action. Meanwhile, my parents panicked. They hovered behind me, gesturing frantically for me to stop. My mom even tried to reach for the phone, but I pushed her hand back without breaking a beat. For once, I wasn't speaking carefully. I was unloading years in blunt detail, unafraid of what they might think because someone finally deserved the uncut version. When Grandpa finally spoke, his voice didn't rise, it grounded. Firm, measured, and heavy. It was less like he was scolding and more like he was sealing a verdict. That tone alone lifted the weight of guilt right off me. For the first time in years, it wasn't my parents' voices dominating the terms. They couldn't overwhelm him, couldn't twist his words, couldn't coach him into agreement. He was the outside force I had needed since the beginning, the one person who wouldn't accept their version of family duty without peeling it apart. I hung up the phone with more relief than I expected. Not the kind where everything is fixed, but the kind where you know you won't be cornered alone anymore. My parents still looked rigid, like statues cracked down the middle, because they knew exactly what that call meant. They had lost their stage. Their lines wouldn't land the same way once he arrived. And in that pause, I felt something new. Not triumph, just clarity. The dynamic that had been running unchecked for years wasn't about to keep rolling the same way. I had found the one person capable of interrupting the show. If my parents had built their power on me breaking silently, then I had just ruined the silence. The house still looked the same, the sagging couch, the hum of the old refrigerator, but everything inside it had shifted. The words I'd spoken were out there now and couldn't be pulled back in. My mom and dad still wore their practiced faces, but I could see the static in their eyes, the way you know a storm's about to split the air. Something in my chest slowed down while the room felt heavier. It wasn't finished, but for the first time, I wasn't waiting to be handled alone. And that was enough to breathe differently for a moment, because the next part wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was his. Grandpa's step into the picture was already set in motion, and when he showed up, the entire energy of the house would flip in an instant. The family showdown. When Grandpa finally stepped through the door, the mood inside shifted instantly. He didn't need to raise his voice or slam the cane in his hand. Just the steady rhythm of it against the floorboards drew every eye in the room. My parents straightened fast, dropping their usual sharp tones and adopting this sudden calm, like they'd been rehearsing normalcy for an audience. Grace angled herself on the couch, trying to arrange her face into polite composure, and Kelsey stayed quiet in the corner, wide-eyed, watching everything unfold. I sat back, listening, because I already knew this wasn't a man that could charm without talk. Grandpa lowered himself into his usual chair, patient but unflinching, and looked right at my dad first. His voice was measured, but each word hit heavier than anything my parents could throw back. He asked one direct question. Why was their son, after years of being forced to work, suddenly expected to hand over his entire savings for Grace's Cosmetic? Surgery? My dad's throat cleared, a stall tactic, and he reached for the only script he knew. He muttered about family unity, about everyone contributing equally. Grandpa tilted his head just slightly, as though that word, equal, was the one he wanted clarified. So he pressed, what exactly did equal mean here? My dad stumbled, trying to paint it as if we all bore equal weight, sidestepping the obvious fact that Grace avoided every responsibility anyone else carried. When his answer fell thin, my mom jumped into the gap. She pulled every emotional lever she had, repeating that Grace's confidence and her fragile self-esteem could crumble without this investment. She spoke like the procedure was air, not vanity, weaving it into talk about Grace's destiny, her happiness, her suffering. The more she exaggerated, the less sense it made. Grandpa listened carefully, his eyebrows arching almost imperceptibly. Then his gaze shifted directly to Grace. His questions were simple. Why do you need this? What are you doing to contribute to it? How exactly are you planning to take care of yourself at 25? One by one, he placed them right in her lap. Grace blinked, fidgeting with her hair, searching my mom's face for cues. She mumbled something vague about appearances, tossed in that people are always judging, but nothing resembled a real answer. When Grandpa pressed again, she just stammered, circling empty phrases like she was hoping someone else would rescue her. Each attempt collapsed more awkwardly than the last. My parents jumped in, frantic to smooth over the gaps. They spoke over each other, insisting she was the pride of the family, that she deserved his support. My dad argued that I was strong enough to carry extra burdens, while my mom claimed Grace needed the same help because she hadn't found her path yet. Put together, their lines contradicted each other so badly, it sounded like two clashing stories stitched into one. Grandpa didn't interrupt. He just sat still, watching them wrap themselves into knots, clues of favoritism spilling out with each attempt to defend her. From my corner, the whole exchange looked almost theatrical. Grandpa wasn't angry, he was steady, the way a judge sits through shaky testimony. My parents were floundering like lawyers, scrambling without evidence, and Grace, thrown under direct questioning, looked like a witness completely unprepared. Even Kelsey couldn't fully hide her amusement, her hand pressed against her face to quiet a laugh she couldn't let slip. And then Grandpa leaned in. His tone sharpened, not louder, just clearer. He said he had heard all he needed. The pattern was obvious. One child had been treated as if work was his duty from 13 onward, stripped of choice, independence chipped away. The other had been spared every sacrifice, handed excuses, told that dependence was strength. That, he said firmly, isn't support. That's favoritism. That's enabling. And it comes at his expense. The air in the room thinned as the words landed. My parents' faces slipped. They weren't angry in that moment. They were unsettled. They had no clever defense lined up, no script for someone calling it what it was. Grace tried, weakly, to insist she had been misunderstood by outsiders, but Grandpa raised his hand lightly. He didn't scold. He just cut her off with steady finality. Handling criticism is part of growing up. If you fall apart over it, you're not ready for responsibility. She retreated in silence, lips pressed together, shoulders tight, her usual confidence gone. My mom scrambled again, this time grasping at tradition, the claim that sons carry burdens while daughters are sheltered. Grandpa looked at her evenly, cane resting across his knees, said one sentence that ended that argument where it stood. Tradition doesn't justify neglect. It doesn't excuse draining one child for the comfort of another. That was when their voices faltered completely. They avoided his eyes, their earlier certainty broken. Grace tried adjusting her posture to look composed, but her silence spoke louder than anything else. Kelsey kept still, but her eyes flicked toward me, glowing with something close to relief. For the first time, someone outside of us had peeled back the act and left my parents with nothing to hide behind. And me, I could finally breathe. For years, I'd pointed out the imbalance and been told I didn't understand, that I was overreacting, that this was just the way families worked. Sitting there, hearing Grandpa name it out loud in words so exact, broke something loose in me. My parents weren't going to spin their way out. They could blame me all they wanted in the past, but not now, not under his steady voice cutting through every deflection. It felt like the first time the stage they had built was collapsing in front of them, exposed under a single light. Kelsey saw it too. She bit back a grin, hiding it by lowering her gaze, but her shoulders relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. For once, the silence belonged to them, not me. They couldn't rely on shifting the spotlight onto Grace's fragility or on burdening me with new duties. Their logic had cracked wide open. Grandpa had made it plain. This wasn't sacrifice or family unity or love. It was favoritism dressed up as duty, and it couldn't go unchallenged. I sat back, letting the weight of that land, because I knew Grandpa wasn't done. He wasn't here only to point out the obvious and walk away. He was the kind of man who finished what he started, and the way his eyes lingered, first on me, then on Kelsey, made it clear he had already decided on something larger. He hadn't announced it yet, but you could feel it building in the room, heavy under the quiet, and that's where the tension settled, pulling every breath taut. Because everyone in that room sensed what was coming, even if they didn't know the details yet. Grandpa had asked his questions, exposed their act, and called out the favoritism aloud. What came after was no longer a debate, it would be a decision. And that decision was about to shift everything. The inheritance twist. Grandpa waited until the room quieted before he leaned forward, steadying himself on his cane. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "We need to talk about inheritance." The word landed heavier than any lecture. My parents froze but tried to mask it, sitting straighter like this was about to be a reward ceremony. Grace perked up instantly, her expression brightening like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. For me, the idea came out of nowhere. I'd never thought about wills or money set aside for the future, certainly not in the middle of a fight about cosmetic surgery. But the way Grandpa spoke, you could tell he had been preparing for this discussion long before that Sunday afternoon. His calmness contrasted sharply with the way my mom's eyes lit up and my dad straightened his shoulders, trying to project authority he no longer had. Grace smoothed her hair down, as if presentation now would matter more than anything else. Grandpa began by explaining that his estate was valued at $300,000. His original plan, he said, had always been to divide it evenly between his son, me, and my sisters. Equal portions. He let the words sit long enough for my parents to grab hold of them. My mom even nodded quickly, as if encouraging him to stick with the old script. Grace's smile widened. You could practically see her calculating shopping sprees and plane tickets in the pause between his sentences. My dad even gave a smug little look, reassured that he remained central in whatever financial future Grandpa was describing. Then Grandpa shook his head slowly. "That was the plan," he said. "But after sitting here today, watching and listening, I see the truth more clearly." In that instant, the confidence drained right out of the room. Grace stiffened, my mom blinked like she hadn't heard correctly, and my dad's jaw twitched. The silence stretched, waiting for the verdict. Grandpa's voice cut through it. "Inheritance," he said, "isn't a prize for being spoiled. It should support those who've carried weight, those who have shown they'll do something with it." He turned to me first, speaking about the years I'd been forced to work. Years of dog walking, mowing, babysitting, grinding away while my parents praised it as training but never once praised me. He said those sacrifices should not be erased. Then his eyes shifted to Kelsey. He acknowledged the quiet strength she carried, the way she resisted being molded into Grace's shadow, and how much promise her future held. Finally, he looked directly at Grace. He didn't soften his tone. Entitlement is not love, he told her plainly. Being coddled is not care. You've been handed attention, not responsibility. And responsibility is what earns support. When the reallocation came, it was simple and final. He said that Grace would receive $30,000. The remaining $270,000 would be divided evenly between me and Kelsey, $135,000 each. He didn't raise his voice. The air rippled. Grace's mouth opened, but no sound came, and then the shrieking started. She launched into a meltdown so sharp it felt rehearsed. "This isn't fair," she screamed, stomping her heel against the carpet. "I've carried the family's image. I deserve more." She said those exact words as if being the self-appointed face of the household counted as labor. She waved her arms, voice climbing higher and higher until it became noise more than speech. To me, it looked exactly like a reality show elimination. She shrieked like someone had just voted her off an island, complete with quivering lips and wild accusations. She accused me of plotting against her with Grandpa, accused Kelsey of betraying her, even accused Grandpa of choosing favorites. The irony of her complaint was so sharp, I almost laughed out loud. My parents scrambled to contain it. My mom rushed to Grace's side, whispering frantically that it would be okay. My dad's voice cracked as he tried to argue with Grandpa, insisting this was punishment disguised as fairness. He said it wasn't right to rob Grace of her future. He claimed the money would ruin me at my age, and that Grace was the one who needed help finding her path. My mom added that this was her moment to gain confidence, framing plastic surgery as if it were destiny written in stone. Grandpa let them burn through their arguments before answering. He just sat calmly until the noise died down. Then he said, "Favoritism created this, not me. You chose to shelter one child and overburden the other. Don't mistake consequences for cruelty." His words landed heavier than shouts. My parents looked caught between fury and panic, but they had nothing left to throw that didn't already sound hollow. The breakdown in their logic was on full display. They had spent decades convincing themselves that special treatment was care. Now, in a single moment, Grandpa exposed it as the opposite. Kelsey and I didn't need to gloat. The silence in the room did all the work. Grace kept ranting, pacing, her tantrum spiraling, but I barely heard her words anymore. The irony was too sharp. Years of being elevated above us led to the one time it mattered. When it became about real support, she was cut down smaller than anyone else. I couldn't help picturing the scene like one of her precious talent shows, her dramatic cries echoing like the final elimination line. If you'd handed me a bag of popcorn at that moment, I would have passed it to Kelsey so we could watch the spectacle unfold like we've been waiting years for this episode. For the first time, the imbalance wasn't just noticed, it was corrected, plain, and undeniable. Grandpa's calm refusal to budge drove it home. He didn't leave loopholes. He didn't say maybe or later. He made it clear this wasn't punishment. It was balance. He even glanced toward my dad when he said, "Favoritism destroys families. If you divided responsibility evenly, this conversation wouldn't look like this." That sentence silenced my dad more than anything else. The three of them, my parents and Grace, sat locked in disbelief, trying to process the reality that no tantrum or guilt trip could undo the numbers. For once, their years of favoritism hadn't just been challenged. It had turned into real loss for the one child they insisted should never go without. Kelsey and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us said anything. The satisfaction wasn't loud. It was steady. For the first time in years, the weight didn't fall on us. It fell back on the ones who had earned it. The room still buzzed with Grace's frustrated sobs, my mom whispering comfort, my dad glaring at Grandpa. But none of it mattered now. The decision was sealed, the distribution clear, and their power to control the outcome had vanished. Favoritism had written its own ending, and Grandpa only read it out loud. And sitting there, watching the fallout begin, I realized something. This wasn't just about money. It was about truth finally being spoken where it couldn't be twisted anymore. Something had broken open, and there was no going back. Aftermath and sweet justice. The fallout after Grandpa's announcement didn't fade quietly. It lingered like smoke in every corner of the house. Grace erupted first, storming upstairs with enough door slams to rattle the floorboards. Her muffled sobs and dramatic shouts bled through the ceiling, proof she still thought volume equaled influence. My parents, meanwhile, stayed rooted in the living room, stiff and hesitant, like their power had been siphoned away in front of them. Grandpa walked out as calmly as he'd arrived, cane tapping steady against the floorboards, leaving behind a silence my parents couldn't fill. Once the noise from Grace's storm died down, their attention turned to me, but not in the way I'd been used to. For years, every mistake meant lectures. Every success meant silence. That night, with the weight of inheritance now tilting in my favor, their tone rewired overnight. My dad asked about how I planned to manage real money. My mom offered to cook me my favorite meal, a gesture she hadn't bothered with in years. Suddenly, the boy who had been treated like unpaid help was being addressed as if I were now the center of their concern. It was hard not to laugh at the sudden pivot. The warmth in their voices didn't feel earned. It felt rehearsed, performed. I could see them straining to appear supportive, as if acting kind might undo how clearly Grandpa had exposed them. Even my daily routines were rewritten. My dad suggested I cut back on work hours to avoid burnout. This from the same man who once told me exhaustion was a badge of manhood. My mom went as far as excusing me from chores, smiling nervously as if years of responsibility training could be erased in one night. Their efforts weren't kindness. They were stagecraft. Grace refused to join their act. She eventually stomped back downstairs, red-eyed and shaking, demanding answers. She accused me of scheming with Grandpa, accused my parents of abandoning her, and accused the entire family of betrayal. My dad reached to comfort her, but she shoved him back. My mom offered tea, which Grace swatted away, declaring the house toxic. It was the same show we'd seen countless times, only louder and less effective. For the first time, her meltdown didn't sway anyone. Kelsey and I didn't intervene. Well, you didn't mean to. We shared a glance, both of us instantly aware this was different. Her shoulders dropped, her eyes softened. She'd spent years in that house, bracing for Grace to always come first, and now she finally had proof that weight could shift elsewhere. Watching her absorb that recognition mattered more to me than my own share of the inheritance. Grandpa hadn't only seen me, he'd seen her too. During the week that followed, the family scrambled to pretend it normal. My parents hovered more, asking about school, checking in on my stress levels, speaking with forced gentleness in every exchange. I'd lived my whole life without these questions, and when they suddenly poured them out now, it wasn't comforting, it was awkward. They weren't respecting me. They were respecting Grandpa's verdict. And even if I didn't buy their act, I still savored the irony. For once, I wasn't the one auditioning to prove myself. They were. Grace, on the other hand, sulked and staged her rebellion in smaller circles. She skipped dinners, scrolled through her phone with exaggerated sighs, and blasted vague posts online about being betrayed by those closest to her. But sympathy never arrived. The few comments she got didn't feed her the validation she craved, and her isolation hung heavier than before. Being denied entitlement for the first time left her scrambling for support in spaces that weren't interested. All of this left me balancing two thoughts. First, I couldn't mistake fear for respect. It was clear my parents were only adjusting because they'd been cut off at the knees by Grandpa. Their kindness was a mask. Second, and far more important, I couldn't let relief make me overlook Kelsey. I was already college-bound, my scholarship securing the path. She still had years left in the house. She would still deal with daily pressures, the nudging and comparisons aimed at shaping her into a copy of Grace. That reality didn't disappear just because Grandpa tilted the scales. So I made myself a quiet promise. The inheritance meant more than financial freedom. It was insurance. If Kelsey ever needed to break away, if she ever reached her own limit, I'd make sure she had the means. Grandpa had trusted me with resources, and I knew exactly how I'd use them. This decision wasn't only for my future, it safeguarded hers. That awareness made everything sharper. Grace's tantrums no longer stung. They looked almost theatrical next to the quiet relief in Kelsey's posture. My parents' sudden concern played like comedy more than sincerity. The entire system had flipped in a single conversation, not because I fought louder than them, but because someone strong enough finally stepped in and refused to play along. One moment in particular stays with me. A few days later, Grandpa called to check in. He asked about school and the scholarship before pausing. Then he said something simple that cemented everything I'd been feeling. I respect you more than I ever respected your father. It was short and calm, but it struck harder than any lecture my parents had ever thrown. For years, I'd been treated like nothing I did was enough. In one sentence, Grandpa erased that script and replaced it with recognition I never thought I'd hear. From that point, things at home felt almost like an upside-down play. Grace, the self-proclaimed star, sidelined and sulking. My parents scrambling in backstage panic. And me, center stage against their will, holding a role I never chased but now couldn't be pushed from. Even with the absurdity of it all, I couldn't help a small laugh at the irony. They once demanded I bankroll Grace's makeover. Instead, Grandpa put the future in my hands. That was the real justice, not revenge, but balance. Grace didn't get what she demanded. My parents didn't keep control of the narrative. Kelsey and I left the room with recognition instead of resentment, real opportunity instead of scraps. If the path forward still had its difficulties, at least it wasn't weighed down by their lopsided script anymore. And as life started shifting toward what came next, packing for college, managing new responsibilities, figuring out how to support Kelsey when she needed it, I kept thinking about the irony of it all. They tried to teach me that duty meant sacrifice, that my role was to carry weight for others. But with one decision, Grandpa showed that fairness carries its own power, and favoritism eventually crumbles under its own weight. That irony mattered less for comedy now, and more for what it revealed. Favoritism isn't harmless, and it doesn't fade quietly. It tears at the foundations until something gives way. And once it's exposed, you can't ignore the cracks it leaves behind. Favoritism might pass for love when you dress it up with excuses, but in reality, it ruins trust. My parents thought they were raising me into strength and shielding Grace out of care. What they really created was a spotlight that burned one kid down while leaving the other untouched. The moment money forced fairness, the illusion shattered. I know I'm not the only one with an unequal childhood. Have you lived through favoritism in your family? Drop a single sentence below. I'll read the best ones. And to end on a smile, turns out being the man of the house finally paid off, just not the way my parents planned.